Hi, welcome to our panel, Dawn of a New Day, a beginner's guide to world building. So this panel's goals are to teach you the fundamentals of world building and some methods to use to apply to your own worlds for in the future. My name is Grace Fiacco. I'm a fourth year physics major at RIT, and I'm also president of the Game Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Justin Levine. I graduated from RIT a year ago with a degree in game design and development, and I was one of the co-founders of the same orchestra.
Oh, great. Cool.
Yeah, press the button.
Oh, I need to press the button. Okay, so let's start off with some basic definitions. What is a world? So this is a quote from this book right here, Collaborative World Building for Writers and Gamers by Trent Hergenrader. He was a professor I had. He taught me a lot of stuff about world building, which I'm relaying in this talk. He says, a world is a general description that attempts to capture a given place at a given time. It's pretty standard for a world. Another important quality is that worlds help ground a reality, and this reality doesn't need to be our own reality on planet Earth. It can be another reality where it doesn't abide by the same laws that we do, or whatever under the sun you would like to make. So there's two different kinds of worlds that you need to differentiate from. One is a primary world, which is your overarching world that encompasses a lot of smaller worlds. And then your secondary world, which is the smaller world that your story is going to take place in, but it needs to still abide by all of the laws established in your primary world. So worlds are important because they support and structure stories. Without worlds, it's very difficult to have successful stories. They provide stages for events to happen and are very useful for story-driven games like RPGs. The worlds provide the rules and motivations for the characters and people and places within your world to react to different stimuli that are presented to them. And so without the world, you don't really have that guidebook to show how your characters will react in the setting they are in. Another nice quote that I like is, a sufficiently complex world will serve as an engine driving stories told from the perspective of different characters who will view the world in different ways and will face different challenges based on their position in society. It's a mouthful, but I really like this quote because it describes worlds as engines. They are the driving force behind your stories within and your characters. And I think that is very important to keep in mind.
So yeah, worlds, they're kind of like the stage of our story where something's taking place. So just intrinsically, there's a very strong coupling between what a world is and what the stories are that take place inside of it. And so they're meant to be dynamic, they're meant to be interactive. You want something to happen so that way you have something to tell. There are events that are going to happen in that world. And this is a quote from a book, The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses by Jesse Schell, which has very great perspectives on game design as a whole. And he says, a story is nothing more than a sequence of events that someone relates to someone else. So something happens and you tell that to an audience, whether it's through a game, through a book, through a movie, any source of media. And so since there's this strong coupling, I took one of his ideas about stories and kind of thought about how worlds and stories actually fit together. So there's two main approaches. There's a string of pearls, which is basically you tell a story with non-interactive pieces, which is the string, and a bunch of pearls, which are basically areas where you have free movement. So that's more of the gameplay. And typically when you're looking at a string of pearls, the story is very well defined, and then you're going to kind of build a world around that and add more of the lore and the details around the story. And the converse of that is you have a story machine where you build a world, you build out all that lore and the relationships. And so the world comes first, and then you add some kind of stimuli, and there's a ripple effect, and a story will come out of that pretty naturally.
Okay, so let's talk about how to actually build a world, since that is the purpose of our talk today. Everything from here on out is going to be pulled from this book, and again, I strongly encourage you to check it out and buy it. It's a really easy read, and it has a lot of insightful information that we won't be covering today just due to time restrictions. So yeah, let's get going. So first, we need to talk about the building blocks of our world. There's two main sections that you need to focus on. First is your framework, which will provide the support for all of the structures and substructures that go on inside the world. So in your framework, we have scope, sequence, and perspective. And we're going to talk about these more in depth on later slides. And in your structures, you have your governance, your economics, social relations, cultural influences, along with other things. And these all have different categories within them that will shape how the world interacts with your environment.
So I'm going to start by going into some of the different framework categories. So these are kind of the more static characteristics that our world is built on top of. And so the scope, here we're talking about the breadth and the depth of the world. So the breadth is just, what are the things? How many things are there? What's the map look like? The physical space. And the depth is going to be the level of detail we have in each of these spaces. And typically depth will have certain locations that are the focal points, certain cities that, or sub-locations, places in that city that might have more depth than other areas. So you want to think about depth both holistically and in these focal points separately. The sequence is the timeline, the order of events that things happen in the world. And we're also going to be focusing on the termination points. So these are going to be past events that are historically important, that started making some changes into present day and the future. We're going to be talking about events that are happening in the future that might be the end of our story or some result of things that happen after the story. And then we have to define where in this timeline is the now. Where does everything actually take place? And then perspective. Who's telling the story? What are the eyes of the story? Are we looking through a first-person lens, a third-person lens, or a second person, which you won't normally see? And then also, when you're looking through these lenses, is it a limited perspective or an omnipotent perspective? So do we know everything, or do we only know what the character knows? And similarly, is this perspective a neutral or a subjective perspective? As in, is there a bias in what you're looking at, or is it just plain facts?
All right, now let's look into some of these structures that I talked about earlier. So first off, we have governance, and governance is the political rules that exert some measure of control over members of a society. And substructures within this category are government presence, rule of law, and social services. Government presence being the role of government in your everyday life. Rule of law is how they enforce laws and how they administer justice. And social services are basic care and needs provided by the government to their citizens. Economics are the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth and property. And we have economic strength, wealth distribution, and agriculture and trade. Economic strength is the measure of the production of a society or the possession of many commodities or resources. Wealth distribution is how this wealth that you have is divided among your population and your different classes. And agriculture and trade is a society's self-sufficiency and how they exchange resources with other societies. Social relations handle the level of rights that exist for different groups in your society and how these groups interact with each other. So some common examples are race relations or classes or gender relations, but you can have other things if your world has an emphasis on, say, things like different creatures, different sexual orientations, different ages, if things like that. It's not set in stone. It is really whatever you make it to be. And lastly, in cultural influences, we have shared values and beliefs of the society as a whole. So here is where we put in our military influences, our religions, our technology, and arts and culture. If you also had magic in your world, you'd also have magic in here and whatnot. On to the next slide. See, here are some examples of other categories that they are included in the book. And you can also make up the list. The list can include whatever you want. But here's extra categories that you can add in at your own leisure. Alrighty, so this lovely deck of cards is portrayed on the screen right there. This is what we use to develop the case studies that we're about to talk to you about after this. So very briefly, the cards are just a way to visualize all of these structures and substructures within your world and assign different values to represent how strong or weak they are a force in your society. So the green represents government. I don't think you can see the words very well from here. It's kind of blurry. Blue is economics. Yellow is races and culture and social, and red is arts and culture. And so the cards 1 through 5 on the side are the ranking system for how strong or weak it is in the society. And we also have stable and trending cards, which are shown on the other side. And this can help you determine what areas are in flux and what are static in the present day. It helps establish tension points in your world.
Yeah. So a lot of times these cards can be randomized to kind of give some kind of foundations of what your world will look like and the limitations. This limitation can often lead to very creative things that you might have not have come up like on your own. But of course, you can use the cards however you want. Everybody's creative process is going to be a little different.
Yeah, it's a good creative exercise too if you just want to deal out some cards and then spend an hour brainstorming. It's a great way to get your brain thinking and getting ideas flowing. You never know what can come out of it. All right, so on to some case studies. So we are going to talk a little bit about Final Fantasy X. No surprise there. BioShock, the first game, is specifically the City of Rapture, and Mass Effect. And we're going to talk about the Citadel in Mass Effect. So on to Final Fantasy X. Click it. Yeah. Okay, so first let's talk about our framework. Our scope is the continent of Spira, and this game is uncharacteristic in the high amount of detail in both its breadth and depth for all of their focal points. All of their cities are very complex, and they have a lot of things very well developed, which at least I think they do. Our sequence, it takes place in present-day Spira, but generally your game does take place in present-day, whatever that is. In the middle of this cycle of summoners and sins. I'm not going to get into the story of this game just because that would take very long, and we don't have time for that. So some important key parts, though, is termination points. In the very beginning, where all of this story really started, the god Yu Yevon created this monster sin as a defense mechanism for Zanarkand, and now we're in the middle of a cycle of summoners fighting sin and defeating it temporarily to bring about some peace to the land before it is reincarnated. And so the end goal of this world is sin permanently being defeated and the eternal calm is restored to Spira. So the game is from Titus's point of view, so it's a limited third person. You find out what he finds out as he finds it out. All right, so governance. We have government presence as a 5, so it's very strong, but it's trending down because of a lot of the tension points revolving around the religion and government in the game. So the government is located in the capital city of Spira, Bevel, and it's very heavily intertwined with religion. I'm talking about government, but I'm also talking about religion at the same time because they are so closely intertwined. The Council of Maesters acts as the government, but they also act as the head of the religion, and it's led by a Grand Maester. And this council is shown on the bottom picture. It's kind of dark there, but there were not very good pictures online I could find. And they have complete control over the politics, the economy in Spira. Rule of law, it's pretty high. I put it as a 4. And they use fear of sin and hope of the summoners destroying sin as a way to control the population and convince them to follow the teachings that religion teaches them. And so that is how they maintain order throughout all of Spira. And social services are not very heavily touched on, which is why I put it as a 3. Villages and small towns basically rely on their local community for support, especially in the wake of an attack from sin, which happens very often. So on to economics. Economic strength is a 1. It's very low. The economy is in constant turmoil due to all of these attacks on all of their villages and cities from sin. And so Spira is constantly rebuilding everything all the time. So there's no real good time period where they are stable because nothing is ever set in stone and certain, except for sin's destruction of everything. Wealth distribution is a 2. It's very low because there's only 2 big cities that are really important in the game, and it's Bevel, the capital, and Luca, which is it's the home of Blitzball, and that's their favorite game in the game. It's like the underwater soccer of America and Europe. So most of the wealth is concentrated in these 2 cities because of the government in Bevel and Blitzball tournaments bringing in wealth in Luca. Agriculture and trade is a 5 because the majority of Spira is made up of small coastal cities, and a lot of these people have occupations that are like farming, fishing, sailing, crafting, artisans, and they also have travel agencies because people like to travel here too. So social relations can be a little dicey, but we'll go over just the basics. The most common races you deal with are humans, the Albed, Guado, and Ronso. So the main relation you see is between the humans and the Albed. The Albed are like a faction of humans. They use a different language. They isolated themselves from society because there was a war between them and the humans called the Machina War, where they basically use forbidden technology called Machina, old technology that the government and the church has renounced as like evil and sin related, and so people avoid it, and they've all been banned. They're trying to recover lost histories and doing a lot of things that go against the church's teachings. And so the relationships between the human and the Albed are very tense, and people do not like each other. So class relations are also pretty low. There's basically maesters, there's summoners and their guardians, and then there's civilians. And the gap between the two are very large because the maesters and summoners are the chosen ones by Yu Yevon. They follow his word, and they are very holy. The summoners defeat sin, the maesters guide everyone through the religion. So they are basically untouchable by society, and so the gap between them is very large and unbreachable. And gender relations is a 4. It's not very heavily touched on. You know that Maester is a male exclusive role, but summoners and guardians are any gender, any race, so there's really no discrimination there. It's just very hard to get into it. But other than that, like, gender seems to be pretty standard. It's not bad. Next. All right, and lastly, we'll talk about some cultural influences. They have a pretty low military. Their 2 military sections that you encounter are the Crusaders, which their main goal is to protect the continent from sin. So they only really pop up when sin is around, and you don't deal with them ever again. They don't really do too much other than that. You can't really do too much against a giant monster. But then there's also, in Bavel, a sect of warrior monks that exist to protect the maesters. And those are the only 2 forms of military that we see. Religious influence, as government, is 5 and trending down. So again, they basically are the same thing in the purpose of this game. Everyone follows the teachings of Yu Yevon. The summoners are very highly revered, and the maesters control everything. And technology is a 1 because the Machina War created such a deep hatred of all of this old technology. So Spira currently is in a very primitive, stagnant world, and they refuse to evolve and change with the times. And arts and culture is also pretty low, because everyone's not very unified. Everyone is in a lot of turmoil. So Blitzball is the sole connecting force between all of these towns and cities, and they only ever all get together and play nice when Blitzball comes around. And so that's a wrap for Final Fantasy X. There's a lot.
Yeah, so next case study we're going to look at is BioShock, and specifically the city of Rapture. And so the scope of the game takes place in an underwater city. So it's a small breadth, although it has a very deep depth. There's a lot of details. Also, it's underwater, very at like the base rock, so it's very deep. And then as for the sequence, our story is going to take place in the year 1958. Rapture itself has some important historical events. It was announced in 1945, and the important thing to say here is that the city was made basically to escape any kind of government or religion, so that way people can just act in their own interest and focus on logic and reason. It opened in 1946, where a bunch of people were invited and people started moving in. And then in 1951, Rapture closed itself off from the rest of the world and the rest of society. So in 1958, there were some riots that broke out. And basically what happened was all of these very important people came. There was a quick class divide. because people had to do the lower class jobs as well. And it was very severe, resentment was made, and then an uprising came out of that. So 1958 is when these uprisings started, and a civil war broke out. And the events of BioShock 1 happened in the year 1960, just a couple years later. The perspective changes from game to game. BioShock 1 is from the perspective of Jack, who is a guy. I don't want to give too much information. BioShock 2 is taken from a Big Daddy, which is this creature here in the bottom right, known as Subject Delta. Both of these are first-person limited. Yeah, cool. So first we'll look at the government of BioShock. The government, it's a capitalist society with a very laissez-faire, virtually no government. So it starts as a 1, but is actually trending up. And this is kind of the opposite of what the goal of Rapture was, but because of the uprisings, Andrew Ryan, the guy who made the cities, created this oligarchic council to basically try and keep everything under control and from exploding. And the reason why there's no government was because of logic and reason. Rule of law was a 2. There is no law that comes from the government, but there still are police. The catch is that the police are actually a private service that is subscription-based. So it's not that there are no laws, it's just you need to have money to actually be protected by them. So that's why it's very low, but not a 1, which is weird, but... and then so social services, again, everything's a subscription-based service, so it's a 1. There's nothing from the government.
There's
Even
no
firefighters,
government.
that's a subscription.
Yeah, just burn everything down.
Yep.
You're underwater.
Just poke a hole in the side and you'll be fine. So then if we look at the economics, the wealth distribution is a 1. It's very bad. So this is a quote from Frank Fontaine, who kind of ran the crime business of Rapture.
It's really ugly.
He says, these sad saps, they come to Rapture thinking they're going to be captains of industry. But they all forget somebody's got to scrub the toilets. And so this was a city where people were invited to come. All of the best scientists, all of the best academics, the best artists. And it was a collection of just amazing people, but somebody has to do all the roles in a society for it to function. And so this is what yielded all of that resentment that led to the Civil War. The economic strength was a 4, trending down. And a lot of this, the strength of the economy came from all the technological advancements that happened. In the city of Rapture, the technology was decades past everything on the surface. There was no social services or any support from the government, which also led to a lot of distrust of the government. So while all this success was happening and the lower class was becoming even further from the upper class, the war broke out, and because there was no trust in anyone supporting anything, everybody took their money out of the banks in Rapture. Part of this was because of a drug culture where they were using the money to get at them.
Drugs.
And everyone taking their money out of the banks led to a crash, and the currency in Rapture became basically worthless very quickly. So it started high, trended down quickly. Agriculture and trade is a 3. Most of the trade is centered in the district of Arcadia, which has agricultural research centers, a tree farm, which is partly used to generate oxygen, and there's a farmer's market there, which is open to all. And this is important because everything's subscription-based, right? It's very capitalist. The farmer's market was one of the few places where anyone could go. You didn't have to be a paying customer. So it's a 3 because there was a lot of agriculture and a lot of self-sufficiency, but the trade and the general rights of trading between classes was very low. Then if we look at the social relations within Raptures, race relations were a 3, but trending down. They're not very explicit about race in the first 2 games until the DLC Minerva's Den from Bioshock 2. And theoretically, Rapture is purely a meritocracy. But there are some kind of references to subconscious bias that are very inherent in society, and especially once the Civil War starts to break down society as a whole, these biases start coming out more and more. And that's a lot of what Minerva's Den deals with. It's kind of the fact that when things started becoming a mess, they needed, or a lot of society started to just blame certain groups of people. And so a lot of racism started to come out as a result of that. Class relations started as a 2. They weren't good because of the big wealth distribution gap. And it was trending down as the Civil War started to escalate. Gender relations are a 2 as well. They're somewhat similar to the race relations in that a lot of it was subconscious, but it was a little bit more intense than the race relations in Bioshock or in Rapture. One of the big things is that males and females tended to have pretty gender-typed roles, and there was a lot of kind of bias that existed in the 60s as well. And because they had gender-typed roles, there were very few women who were actually in positions of power. There were some important ones, which is why it's not a 1, but for the most part, it was a male-dominated society. Cultural influences, military, nada, it's a 1. Government's not doing anything for people. Also, they're underwater, so they probably weren't going to war much. Religious influences was a 1, but is actually trending up. Andrew Ryan was very against religion. It's actually one of the things that he was going away from when he created the idea of Rapture in the first place. You walk to the city and you see a sign, no gods or king, only man. That's it. Everything's based off of objectivism, which is a book by Ayn Rand. It's an idea from the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, which was a reaction to Marxism and a lot of the bad things that came out of that. And as far as religion, there's no open religion. Christianity exists as an underground religion. Frank Fontaine, one of the things he smuggled in to the city was Bibles and crosses. And so most of the religion that existed was in the lower class, and as that grew more, there was a little bit of a larger underground religion that existed. And there were some other minor ones as well in addition to Christianity. Technology was a 5. That came up very quick just from all of the brilliant scientists that were brought to one place to collaborate. Also, they were able to do some experiments that were very immoral, because pretty much as long as you were helping science and you were helping things move forward, it was seen as a good thing. So technology was a 5. It was very high. They made a city underwater. That's pretty impressive. They had geothermal generators, a gene-based supercomputer, and a self-sufficient biodome.
Intense drugs.
And drugs. Drugs that literally changed your DNA to basically turn you into superheroes, but darker and spookier. And then arts and cultures was a 4 because of all the great artists that came. But it was a smaller population of people who were coming. It was trending down as everyone started losing their mind in the Civil War. There was this guy, Sandy Cohen. He was one of the main guys who ran the arts of the city. And basically what happened was when everyone started going crazy from all the drugs that were used in society, he just started murdering people who didn't like his art as a logical reaction. And he would murder them very gruesomely, cover them with plaster, and that was his art. So I'm going to say that's going down, in my opinion. And so that declined pretty quickly, pretty rapidly. And yeah, so that's a brief overview of the world of Rapture and Bioshock. And now we are going to look at Mass Effect.
Ooh.
So the framework, it's broad. It is the Milky Way. It is the galaxy. And so the depth is really focused on its focal points, although the focal points do go pretty deep. into what's actually going on and the relationships between all the different worlds. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the Citadel, which is basically a big space station that was the center of a bunch of different alien races and held a bunch of embassies. And so it was a big melting pot. Our story actually starts 1 million years BCE. So we're going to skip a little bit because that's a lot. We're going to start at 500 BCE, where the Citadel Council was made, and this is just kind of a central governing body of the Citadel. 300 BCE, there's the Unified Banking Act, which basically made kind of like a cryptocurrency that unified all of the galaxy's money, so that way it could be easily communicated what the value of things are. 1 CE, there is the Rachni War, which the brief overview is, in the world of Mass Effect, there's faster than speed travel, and this happens through these mass relays that no one really knows anything about, and they open a dormant one, and this alien insect race comes through, and they're not friendly, and they start killing everyone, and no one's able to do anything diplomatic or communicate with them, and it's a big fight that unified a lot of the galaxy and a lot of the races. Skip ahead a couple thousand years, humanity is starting to finally get involved with this greater galactic scene. 2148, humanity discovers the physics that allows this faster than light travel. They find this on Mars. Soon after, they find a mass relay and are starting to try and figure out what this is, but it's dormant, which people don't like because of the Rachni War. And so in 2157, they come into the first contact with another race, the Turians, who are very militaristic, and the Turians attack them, and quickly leads to an intergalactic conference that brings the Citadel Council in, as humanity quickly will learn about the rest of the things that are happening in the galaxy. So most of the story takes place in that 2100s era, and the perspective is from Commander Shepard, who is third person limited, and he is kind of a figurehead for the human race, and eventually runs the effort towards the main antagonists in the series.
Alrighty, so now that we've had our history lesson, let's talk about government. So the government in the Citadel is a 5. It's very high because the Citadel Council founded the Citadel. They rule all of Citadel space. They're made up of 3 main races, as shown on the screen, which you can't see very well. They're Asari, Solarians, and Turians are the 3 races that make up the Citadel Council. They also have embassies for a lot of other races, too, so they kind of just watch over everyone. The Asari are mainly diplomats in this whole thing, while the Solarians handle intelligence, espionage, and they're also very tech-savvy. And the Turians handle their military. They control the Citadel fleet, and so that is basically the army we have. Rule of law is a 4. This is a bureaucracy, and so the embassies are bound by Citadel conventions, and each leader of the council handles different aspects of government, which I just mentioned briefly. So social services are also a 4. They have health care for all of their citizens and a lot of government-run refugee camps, because I'd imagine there's a lot of refugees in an entire galaxy. And there's also security for your residents called Citadel Security Systems, right? Yeah,
yep.
That's right, CSEC.
Often referred to as CSEC.
CSEC.
So then if we look at the economic strength is very high, and a lot of this is because of that Unified Banking Act, where we have not just a global economy, but an intergalactic economy that's stabilized by just so many different factors that just makes the variance not very high. So it's very stable. And also note that we're talking about the Citadel here, and this is just one of the secondary worlds in the universe, and all of the different secondary worlds do have different economies and different values that we're talking about. And also the Asari act as diplomats, so they're able to help centralize all of these ideas. Although it was the Volus, which is another race that originally made the credit system. The wealth distribution is a 3. It's kind of semi-typical of typical cities where you have your rich areas, you have your poor areas. The majority of the citizens are kind of middle class, working class. The poor area of the city is known as the wards. The rich area is the presidium. And for the most part, these are all inhabited by just a variety of different races. Agriculture and trade is a 4. It's very high. A lot of the races are all bringing in their own innovations, their own technologies. So there's tons of shops, tons of restaurants everywhere. And in particular, there's a region known as the Zakara Ward, where there is kind of the center of commercialization of the Citadel. Tons of shops, tons of restaurants, a lot to do there.
All right, so social relations. This is pretty complicated considering there are lots and lots of races, but we won't talk about them all, only a few. So in general, there's peace between a lot of the races due to the Citadel Council and all of these embassies. So everyone is pretty much at peace. But there are animosity between the Turians and the humans, which is due to the First Contact War, which we talked about earlier, because people don't like being shot at and starting wars with other people. That's frowned upon in society, pretty much. So yep. There's another race called the Quarians, which are considered the outcasts of society. And very briefly, they created AIs called the Geth, and these Geth kind of just went on a killing rampage against everyone in the galaxy also. So people don't like that either. So they don't really like the Quarians for what they did. AI is now outlawed, so that's not great. But the last race I wanted to touch on is the Krogans, that lovely fellow up at the top. Nice and pretty. Krogans, because of a very long history with the Citadel, they dislike all Citadel races. They basically committed almost genocide on the Krogan race due to nice rebellion that they threw, and 1,000 years later they're still not recovered from it, and they still hold a very strong grudge against all of the races in the Citadel, as happens. Class relations are a 3, so they're pretty standard for classes. It's differentiated by location, which we talked about on the last slide. The wealthy mainly live in the presidium, and the working class and the poor live in the wards. The presidium has a lot of the government offices, embassies, a lot of rich recreational facilities, and they also have a day-night cycle, so they can sleep at normal hours. The wards don't have all of that. It's a lot more packed together. They're like very cramped cities, and they do not have a day-night cycle implemented, so it's always nightlife, always bustling, and it leads to a lot more culture, but it's also a little bit more dirty and cramped. Gender relations are a 4 because it's heavily dependent on race. In the Citadel, like, gender is not super big just because every race has their own customs. Like, Solarians have a very huge gender divide. They have a very deep tradition of women being kept hidden from, like, the open. So their race only allows a few women to be born each year, so it's a very male-dominated population. And women are generally kept in political roles behind the scenes, so no one sees what they're doing, where the men are the businessmen and the academics and workshops and stuff, so they're the ones that are out in the open and dealing with other races.
Yeah.
The Asari are another race that have a peculiar view on gender. Since they are monogendered, they can mate with any species of any gender, any species. So they don't really care too much about other people's gender and life choices because they do what they want.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to live.
And also particularly on the Citadel, because that is like the world we're talking about specifically. Everyone kind of learned to live with each other pretty well, so most of those prejudices and individual race ideas don't come into play too much to create conflicts. It's more like on their home worlds that any of this can be like an issue. Cool. And so the last section is the cultural influences. The military influence is a 5, and that's because there's a very large Citadel fleet, which is a conglomeration of a bunch of different races and a bunch of different contributions. That's kind of like the main defense force. It's led by the Turians, who are a very war-minded, militaristic race. And yeah, so they're very protected. The religious influences are two. There's no main religion. In fact, there's not much religion at all in the world of Mass Effect, although certain races do have pretty strong beliefs of religions, and it's very evident, but there's not much like discrimination or anything like that against religions. They just kind of live peacefully by each other. Technology is a 5. We're in space, lots of alien races, faster than light speed travel, all that good stuff. On the Citadel in particular, a lot of the like, they kind of act as like tourism ads that give you a lot of information about different places, but more personal. There are these virtual intelligences that kind of look like people as holograms that give you a whole bunch of information. Yeah, and there's the mass relays. There's also the AI and the Geth, which I want to point out that Geth War that led to the banning of AI is important because although they don't like AI, it still does exist. Unlike in like Final Fantasy X, where they used to have technology and they're just like, yeah, we're not going to make that anymore. And then arts and culture is a 3. The wards contain most of the culture of the city just because that's where most of the people live. And also because it's middle class, people tended to stay with a lot of their like home world ideals there. And it's a lot of those home world cultures that are brought up that kind of make this melting pot that creates a lot of the cultures of the Citadel. Although most of it is not kind of like super thrown in your face as you walk around. And it does have its own culture, but it is a little bit subdued into the side. The Tesseri ward, I think is how you pronounce it, is one of the main areas of culture where there's a whole bunch of music halls and music performances that take place. Yeah, and those are some of the cultural influences that define the Citadel. So
We did it. Yay.
we kind of went through all our case studies. We went through a lot of stuff. And the point of this talk is not to say, like, look at these games and assign numbers to everything. But it's more of the mind frame and, like, that kind of perspective that you can get when you break down high-level ideas, like government, break it into subcategories. And when you look at all of them, you can kind of see what the numbers might be and also what the numbers mean in terms of how they relate with other numbers and how this can kind of create story elements and create relationships within the world. And you know, if you use the cards to kind of randomize and have like some numbers that you can use as a foundation, you can kind of create like a palette of what your world's going to look like. So if you didn't hear any of our last slides and you were to look at this chart, you can kind of get an idea of some of the differences that would be like Final Fantasy versus Bioshock. Bioshock, there's no government. It's all very low numbers there. It's white. That's going to have very big implications for things that can and cannot happen. Final Fantasy has much stronger government. Mass Effect has very strong government. And so it's just, it's a good perspective to kind of like look at the characteristics of everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You make a much more believable story if you can remember a lot of the smaller details in areas that maybe your story doesn't necessarily hit outright. Because if you're doing an adventure and you're not thinking about the politics of the city next to you, really, you're just thinking about your next adventure. But with those politics and the government and the economy, it makes a very realistic picture and it makes your audience believe your story more and it makes them engage with it more. And that is the key to a successful story, is having something that your audience like cannot put down. They are engaged, they are in there, they believe it is real.
So it's really like that suspension of disbelief that like makes a great story. It's, you know there's not a city underwater, but if you're playing a character there and you can just stay immersed and like believe it as you go through the experience, that's really awesome. And it's kind of the coherency of these characteristics that really make everything stand out. Yeah. Anything else you want to add, Grace?
I don't think so. That's basically it. I mean, I could talk forever about this, but I can't. So I took an entire course in college about world building. So
Yeah.
I can go on.
And also
tell
keep
you
in
all about
mind
this.
that we did gloss over a lot of those story elements because
Yes.
we tried to keep this
No
as
spoilers.
spoiler
I haven't
free
played
as
Mass Effect
possible.
or BioShock yet. I started BioShock the other week, but I didn't finish it in time because it was only the other week. It's also scary.
So yeah, we hope you
Yeah, thank
enjoyed
you.
the talk.
Thank
And
you
if
so
anyone
much.
has any questions,
Yeah, raise your
definitely
hand,
and
come
chat.
up. Yeah.
Or raise your hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.